When we think about our health, particularly our brain and body functioning, there are few factors as insidious and as underestimated as sugar and processed foods. While the taste of these substances can offer a brief hit of pleasure, the consequences they carry span far beyond the tongue, affecting neural circuitry, hormonal balance, immune responses, mood regulation, and metabolic control. In today's modern environment, sugar and processed foods are not only common, they're nearly unavoidable. But to understand their full impact, we need to look beyond superficial labels and dive deep into the mechanisms by which they alter our biology, particularly at the level of the brain-body connection. Let's start with the most immediate and deceptive effect, the reward system. When sugar enters the body, particularly in refined or added forms such as sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, it rapidly spikes blood glucose levels. This spike triggers a cascade of responses beginning with the pancreas secreting insulin, which is tasked with moving that glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells for energy or storage. Simultaneously, sugar activates dopaminergic circuits in the brain, especially within the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area regions crucial for our experience of motivation and reward. In this way, sugar hijacks the very system that evolved to reinforce life-sustaining behaviors such as social bonding, nutrient acquisition, and reproduction. The repeated stimulation of these dopaminergic pathways creates a feedback loop. Over time, the sensitivity of the system declines, meaning more sugar is required to elicit the same reward response. This is not unlike the neural adaptations we see in drug addiction. So when we discuss sugar as potentially addictive, it's not a metaphor, it's a neurochemical reality. And the concerning part is that this doesn't just affect behavior in the moment, it reshapes how the brain prioritizes future behavior. The brain becomes increasingly biased toward short-term reward, compromising impulse control and weakening executive function. That's why individuals who consume high amounts of sugar and processed food often report difficulty concentrating, poor memory retention, and a sense of mental fog. Processed foods, which are typically high in not just sugars, but also industrial fats, emulsifiers, preservatives, and artificial flavorings, have a compounding effect. They disrupt the balance of hormones that regulate hunger and satiety, primarily leptin and ghrelin. Leptin signals fullness, while ghrelin signals hunger. When these hormones are functioning normally, they help maintain energy balance. But excessive sugar intake causes leptin resistance, meaning the body produces leptin, but the brain doesn't respond to it. This results in chronic overeating and weight gain. Ghrelin, on the other hand, becomes dysregulated as well, promoting frequent feelings of hunger even when caloric needs have been met. This dysregulation of hormonal signals creates a vicious cycle that's very difficult to escape without conscious intervention. Another underappreciated aspect is the role of inflammation. Consuming processed foods, particularly those with high levels of refined carbohydrates and trans fats, leads to the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. These cytokines can cross the blood-brain barrier and affect microglial cells, the brain's resident immune cells. When microglia become overactive, they begin to degrade synapses and reduce neuroplasticity. This is particularly alarming in the context of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where chronic inflammation is a known contributing factor. So the seemingly harmless decision to consume a sugary snack isn't just about caloric intake. It's an act that may contribute to long-term cognitive decline. Furthermore, sugar affects the gut microbiome, an ecosystem of trillions of bacteria that play an essential role in digestion, immunity, and even mental health. Diets high in sugar and processed foods reduce the diversity of beneficial bacteria while promoting the growth of pathogenic strains. This imbalance, known as dysbiosis, leads to increased intestinal permeability, often referred to as leaky gut. When the gut barrier is compromised, toxins and bacteria can leak into the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation and immune dysregulation. This not only contributes to physical ailments such as autoimmune disorders, but also affects mental health, increasing the risk for depression and anxiety through what's known as the gut-brain axis. Interestingly, There is now strong evidence showing that the consumption of refined sugars can interfere with neurogenesis, especially in the hippocampus, the brain region involved in memory formation and emotional regulation. Studies in both humans and animal models reveal that high sugar diets reduce brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF, a protein that supports the growth and survival of neurons. Low BDNF levels have been implicated in depression, cognitive impairment, and a reduced ability to adapt to new experiences. So when we see behavioral and emotional volatility in individuals with high sugar intake, it's not merely a psychological phenomenon, it's a structural and functional change in brain architecture, and there's also the circadian angle to consider. Sugar and processed foods disrupt the natural rhythm of our internal clocks. The human body is designed to function in alignment with circadian rhythms, roughly 24-hour cycles governed by the suprachiasmatic asthmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus and synchronized with light, dark exposure. But insulin, glucose, and even gut microbiota follow circadian patterns. When we consume sugary or processed foods late at night, it throws off this synchrony. Sleep quality suffers, melatonin release is disrupted, and the restorative processes that occur during deep sleep are compromised. Poor sleep, in turn, impairs glucose metabolism the next day, creating a loop of metabolic dysfunction that's difficult to break. What's also fascinating is how sugar interacts with stress pathways. In states of high stress, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis is activated, leading to the release of cortisol. Cortisol raises blood sugar levels to prepare the body for a fight or flight response. But when individuals consume large amounts of sugar, cortisol release is prolonged, and the feedback inhibition of the HPA axis becomes impaired. Chronic activation of this stress axis doesn't just affect mood and anxiety, it impairs immune function, disrupts reproductive hormones, and accelerates biological aging through the shortening of telomeres. This means that a diet high in sugar doesn't just make us feel stressed, it makes us biologically older. Let's also touch on insulin resistance, which is the precursor to type 2 diabetes and a central feature of metabolic syndrome. When cells are repeatedly bombarded with high levels of insulin, often due to continuous high sugar intake, they begin to lose sensitivity to it. The pancreas then compensates by producing even more insulin, which eventually exhausts its capacity. Insulin resistance doesn't just affect blood sugar control. It's tightly linked to increased fat storage, particularly visceral fat, which wraps around internal organs and secretes hormones that further worsen metabolic health. Visceral fat is not inert. It's biologically active and associated with increased risk of heart disease, cancer, and liver dysfunction. Even the cardiovascular system suffers directly. High sugar intake is associated with elevated triglycerides, lower HDL cholesterol, and increased small dense LDL particles, all of which contribute to atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of arteries. This raises the risk of stroke, heart attack, and peripheral artery disease. Additionally, frequent consumption of high-sodium processed foods exacerbates hypertension, further compounding cardiovascular strain. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable. Their brains are in critical stages of development, and regular exposure to sugar and ultra-processed foods can have long-lasting effects on attention, learning, and emotional regulation. Attention deficit symptoms, irritability, and even early signs of depression are often exacerbated by diets high in sugar. The earlier these patterns begin, the more entrenched they become, making intervention harder in adulthood. And while some argue for moderation, it's important to realize that for many individuals, especially those with metabolic or psychological vulnerabilities, sugar is not a neutral substance. Its effects are dose-dependent and cumulative. Even moderate but consistent consumption can lead to desensitization of reward systems, metabolic imbalance, and increased disease risk. It's not just about how much, but how often. Frequency and timing matter just as much as quantity. From a behavioral perspective, sugar and processed food consumption affects decision making. It dulls the prefrontal cortex responsible for planning, impulse control, and foresight. People who consume high-sugar diets show less activation in these areas during cognitive tasks. This may explain why sugar consumption is often correlated with lower academic performance, poor work productivity, and increased risk-taking behavior. The food we eat shapes the mind we use to make decisions, which in turn shapes future behavior, a self-reinforcing loop. One might think the solution is simply to cut sugar and processed foods altogether, but this overlooks the profound grip these substances have on our biology. The transition away from sugar is often met with withdrawal symptoms, headaches, irritability, fatigue, even mild depressive episodes. This withdrawal is real. It reflects the neuroadaptations that have occurred over time. The good news is that the brain and body are plastic, capable of change. When individuals eliminate sugar and processed foods, they often experience a period of discomfort, followed by a restoration of mental clarity, mood stability, and physical energy. This is not anecdotal. It is measurable through biomarkers, imaging studies, and neurophysiological recordings. Finally, it's essential to understand that what we eat is not just fuel, it is information. Every bite of food we consume carries molecular signals that speak directly to our DNA, turning genes on or off, influencing inflammation, repair processes, and longevity pathways. Sugar and processed foods send the wrong signals, ones that promote disease, accelerate aging, and impair cognition. In contrast, whole, unprocessed foods, rich in fiber, healthy fats, lean proteins, and polyphenols, send signals that enhance resilience, neuroplasticity, and longevity. So the conversation about sugar and processed foods isn't just about diet, it's about biology, psychology, behavior, and ultimately agency. By understanding the mechanisms at play, we empower ourselves to make decisions not rooted in guilt or ideology, but in informed awareness. And from that place, true change becomes possible. Let me know if you'd like this version narrated or turned into a video script. Certainly. Here's the continuation of the speech, another 2,000 words in the same voice and tone, building on the previous analysis without headings and without a concluding paragraph. When we begin to look at the broader implications of how sugar and processed foods affect not just individuals but society at large, a more sobering reality emerges. These substances are intricately tied to the global rise in chronic illnesses, conditions that are not only preventable but largely driven by long-term lifestyle behaviors, most notably nutrition. We often hear about public health crises, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, but what's frequently missing from the conversation is the foundational role that consistent consumption of hyper-palatable, nutrient-depleted food plays in initiating and perpetuating these conditions. To better understand how this unfolds across a population, consider the economic and sociocultural accessibility of processed foods. They are engineered for shelf stability, mass production, and low cost. As a result, they dominate low-income neighborhoods and school cafeterias, where access to fresh produce, lean proteins, and healthy fats is limited. What's problematic here is that we're not just dealing with individual choices, we're looking at systemic factors that reinforce poor dietary patterns over time. For children growing up in such environments, taste preferences are wired early. Neural circuits involved in food preference are shaped by repeated exposure. So a child who grows up eating primarily sweetened breakfast cereals and processed snacks will likely develop a palate that finds whole, unprocessed foods bland or unsatisfying. The brain's reward prediction error, its response to unexpected or low reward stimuli, will actually make nutrient-dense food less appealing. This has implications for education, behavior, and emotional regulation. Nutritional neuroscience has repeatedly shown that poor dietary quality is associated with reduced cognitive performance. Specifically, sugar and refined carbohydrates lead to postprandial hypoglycemia, where blood glucose crashes after a spike, which results in fatigue, irritability, and difficulty focusing. In a classroom, this might look like inattention, behavioral disruption, or what gets broadly labeled as learning difficulties. But underlying these behaviors is often a metabolic roller coaster driven by diet. Addressing this from a nutritional standpoint doesn't replace the need for educational support, but it enhances the brain's capacity to engage with learning in the first place. Even in adults, the effects are profound. Research has linked diets high in added sugars with increased incidence of depression and anxiety. Part of this is due to the inflammatory effects on the brain and the disruption of neurotransmitter systems, particularly serotonin and dopamine. But it's also tied to blood sugar fluctuations. When glucose levels are unstable, the brain receives inconsistent energy supplies. Neurons are highly metabolically active cells that require a constant and stable stream of fuel. When that stream is erratic, so is neural communication. Emotional reactivity, mood swings, and decreased resilience to stress are all common outcomes. What's more, these effects often drive individuals to seek further comfort from the very foods causing the dysfunction, perpetuating the loop of self-medication. There is also an emerging body of research exploring how sugar and processed food affect hormonal systems beyond leptin and insulin. Chronic consumption impacts thyroid function by downregulating key enzymes and increasing reverse T3 levels, which inhibit active thyroid hormone. This contributes to fatigue, slowed metabolism, and in many cases, unexplained weight gain. Similarly, high sugar intake in men has been linked to decreased testosterone production, while in women, it can disrupt estrogen and progesterone balance, particularly through its effect on liver detoxification pathways and body fat storage, both of which influence sex hormone metabolism. The endocrine system, which governs everything from reproduction to energy expenditure, is highly sensitive to the metabolic signals created by our food choices. And because sugar is metabolized rapidly and without fiber, it creates sharp spikes not just in glucose, but in downstream hormone activity. Over time, the repeated overactivation and miscommunication within this hormonal network leads to dysfunctions that show up as fertility issues, libido changes, chronic fatigue, and mood disorders. But these aren't always traced back to diet because their manifestation can seem unrelated at first glance. That's why understanding the root cause, at the level of biochemical signaling, is crucial. We also need to explore the impact on the liver. The liver is central to metabolic health, acting as the body's primary filter and metabolic switchboard. When we consume fructose, particularly in the form of HIF, fructose corn syrup, it is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver. Unlike glucose, which is used throughout the body, fructose overloads the liver's processing capacity and is rapidly converted into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. This contributes to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease NAFLD, which is now one of the most common liver disorders in both adults and children in developed countries. NAFLD increases the risk of insulin resistance, systemic inflammation, and even liver fibrosis, which can progress to cirrhosis over time. The alarming part is that many individuals with NAFLD show no obvious symptoms until significant liver damage has occurred. Beyond the liver, let's talk about mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells. These structures convert nutrients into usable energy in the form of ATP. Mitochondrial function is highly sensitive to oxidative stress, which increases with high sugar intake. When there is an overabundance of glucose in the bloodstream, not all of it is efficiently metabolized. Excess glucose undergoes a process called glycation, where sugars bind to proteins and lipids, creating advanced glycation end products ages. These compounds damage tissues and are a major contributor to aging and degenerative diseases. They also impair mitochondrial function, decreasing energy production and increasing the generation of reactive oxygen species. The net result is systemic fatigue, increased vulnerability to cellular damage, and a faster biological aging process. Another key system that suffers is the lymphatic and detoxification system. Processed foods often contain additives, artificial colorings, and preservatives that place a burden on the body's natural detoxification pathways, particularly the liver, kidneys, and lymphatic circulation. The body treats many of these additives as toxins, and the process of filtering them out requires not only robust organ function but also nutrient support, particularly B vitamins, antioxidants like glutathione, and compounds involved in methylation. However, diets rich in processed foods tend to be deficient in these essential nutrients, so the body is being flooded with substances it must detoxify while simultaneously being deprived of the tools it needs to do so. This imbalance creates a backlog in metabolic processing that can manifest as skin issues, chronic fatigue, and impaired immune resilience. Let's not forget the role of processed food in altering satiety and fullness signals. Foods engineered to be hyper, palatable, often combining sugar, salt, and fat, trigger a phenomenon known as hedonic eating, where the drive to consume is based on pleasure rather than true energy need. These foods bypass homeostatic controls that normally tell us when to stop eating. In studies using functional MRI, individuals consuming these foods show decreased activity in the brain's satiety centers and increased activity in reward regions. Over time, the neural pathways that govern fullness and satisfaction become less responsive. This desensitization contributes to overeating and weight gain, but more subtly, it changes our relationship to food, shifting it from a source of nourishment to a mechanism for emotional regulation and compulsive behavior. The skeletal system is not spared either. High sugar diets increase the excretion of calcium and magnesium through the kidneys, weakening bone density over time. Moreover, chronic inflammation from poor diet suppresses osteoblast activity, cells responsible for building bone, while increasing osteoclast activity cells that break down bone. The result is an increased risk for osteoporosis and fractures, particularly in older adults. Additionally, poor nutrition impacts the connective tissue, reducing collagen synthesis and leading to joint instability, slower healing, and increased risk of injury. In terms of immunity, sugar intake has been shown to impair the function of white blood cells, particularly neutrophils, for up to 5 hours after consumption. This means that during those hours, the body's ability to fight off pathogens is significantly reduced. For individuals who consume sugary beverages and snacks multiple times a day, the immune system may be operating at suboptimal levels most of the time. Coupled with the pro-inflammatory state that processed foods promote, this creates an immune environment that is both overactive in attacking self-tissues and underactive in fighting external threats. That's the paradox of immune dysfunction linked to poor diet. It's simultaneously hyperreactive and ineffective. One of the more silent but damaging effects is on vascular health. High levels of circulating glucose damage the endothelial lining of blood vessels, initiating the process of atherosclerosis. Endothelial cells become inflamed, attracting immune cells that oxidize lipids and create plaques. Over time, these plaques can rupture, leading to heart attacks or strokes. Processed foods further contribute to this process through high sodium content, which elevates blood pressure, and trans fats, which disrupt lipid metabolism. What's particularly insidious is that many of these processes occur silently for years, if not decades, before manifesting in clinical disease. That's why early dietary intervention is so critical. It's not about preventing tomorrow's symptoms. It's about altering the trajectory of health decades in advance. From an evolutionary standpoint, our bodies are designed for environments of food scarcity and nutrient density. For most of human history, food was hard, earned, and naturally balanced in its macronutrient composition. The current environment, where energy, dense but nutrient-poor food is abundant, creates a mismatch between our biology and our behavior. This mismatch leads to maladaptive responses like insulin resistance, hormonal imbalance, and overconsumption. The body's systems are simply not evolved to handle the constant bombardment of synthetic ingredients, high fructose sweeteners, and refined grains that characterize the modern diet. On a more cellular level, diets rich in processed sugars and chemicals alter gene expression through epigenetic modifications. DNA methylation patterns are influenced by nutrient intake, and poor diet can silence genes that protect against cancer while activating genes associated with inflammation and cell proliferation. This is one of the reasons cancer rates are associated with dietary patterns. Certain foods quite literally change the way our DNA operates without altering the underlying sequence. Finally, it's essential to consider the psychosocial dimensions of sugar and processed food consumption. These foods are often tied to emotional rituals, social gatherings, and habits formed in childhood. They're used to celebrate, to cope, to distract. So changing dietary patterns is not only a physiological shift, it's a behavioral and emotional one. Breaking these patterns requires understanding not just what to eat, but why we eat the way we do. Cravings are not signs of weakness, they are signals, indicators of imbalanced neurochemistry, nutrient deficiencies, or unresolved emotional needs. When we learn to decode those signals, we gain the ability to intervene at the root, rather than simply suppress the surface. Let me know if you'd like the full version merged or formatted for a talk, YouTube video, or podcast script. Here's a concluding paragraph in the same tone and style as the rest of the speech, without directly naming Dr. Andrew Huberman, understanding how sugar and processed foods impact our physiology, psychology, and long-term health is not about fear, it's about clarity. It's about recognizing the cumulative effects of seemingly small choices and reclaiming agency over systems that often feel automatic. Our brains, our bodies, our emotional lives, they all respond to the inputs we give them. When we shift those inputs toward nutrient-dense whole foods, the changes are not just physical. They are neurological, hormonal, and behavioral. The science is clear. What we eat teaches our brain how to think, our body how to function, and our emotions how to regulate. And while the modern food environment may be engineered for convenience, our biology is engineered for resilience, if we give it the right tools.